Hi, everybody. I'm John Atack. This is my good friend, Dr. Steven Moffic. Hi, Steve.
Hi, John, and hi, everybody out there.
Now, you've just celebrated Thanksgiving, which has brought you to think about the giving of thanks and gratitude and its role. And you've just suggested to me that maybe gratitude plays a part in the formation of cult groups. And I think it is a very interesting dynamic. And I can't think of anyone having discussed that before. So we could break some new ground here. Would you like to start us off with some thoughts?
So either we'll find out that's a ridiculous idea or maybe applicable, because I don't know if you all have a National Thanksgiving Day in Great Britain.
We
Some,
give thanks that the Americans left, yes.
yeah, left. So Canada has a Thanksgiving holiday,
Mm,
I think earlier in November, maybe, and say Israel does not. So there's a variety of how countries address it. And, our Thanksgiving Day is a little controversial in itself now that we know a little more about how
mm,
it developed. So the old story is Indians were invited to a meal by the pilgrims and they had a good time together and so forth. Well, we know a lot of that is not true. And
mm,
the holiday became official, I think, early in the Civil War or before. It was by President Lincoln, made it a national
mm.
holiday. He was hoping it would draw the country together, which it didn't, obviously. We're in a very divisive state right now.
Mm.
So to me,
Since
that
the Civil
also,
War, really.
so the Civil War, yeah.
Yeah.
And so now, most people in the United States consider celebrating Thanksgiving in some way. We've had record travel this week,
Mm,
you know, and the people who like President-elect Trump being elected are probably having a great time. The others are probably mourning. And if you're trying to hold Thanksgiving together in families with both kinds of people, you're in difficulty. And
oh,
many people decided not to have that kind of Thanksgiving, thinking they couldn't talk to one another. Um, so, on the whole, it's based on gratitude way back for the
mm,
food the Indians may have provided, the Native Americans, but also family relationships, right? And I think on the whole, gratitude is a good mental health thing. I call
mm,
it one of the psycho-exemplaries, that we want people to be, especially mutual gratitude. We want people to be
mm,
grateful for what we do to one another. But I think potentially it has problems and side effects, so to speak, just like medication does. And so the gratitude can be perfunctory, it could be full of lies.
yeah.
And it can be, I think, in terms of cults, maybe it's part of the love bomb that is presented to people who are being recruited for cults. So if people who are being recruited feel so grateful for the love they're
Mm,
supposedly being given, isn't that a problem? And it sort of cements them into the relationship. And so that's what got me thinking, is gratitude part of the problem in how people join cults? They
mm,
find something that's really important to them. It's used to recruit them, and it has continued to be used, during the time they're part of the cult. So that's where the idea came from.
mm,
And I wasn't sure whether that had been looked upon before, whether for the real experts in this, which are beyond me, whether they know the answer to this, or it's something that should be looked into more. So I'm
mm.
sure some in our audience probably have their own opinion about this. But
Mm.
anyway, that's where it derived from.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's fascinating. And it the experts in this field, I'm not sure that, as I say, I can't think of a point where this has been addressed. The sense of appreciation you have, I think often in joining an authoritarian sect, a cult, that people, they feel that they found their tribe. They feel that they found a family where they're not functioning fully within their own family sometimes. I mean, I've also seen whole families be recruited
Hmm.
where, the family had a good relationship. And then I'm thinking of a particular situation. There were twins and they were, I don't know, probably in their early 20s. And one of them got involved, got the other twin involved, and then they got their parents in. And that family stayed together through the experience and they left together as well. But often I think it is that somebody feels, I mean, I know I felt displaced. I felt, I was 19 when I got into Scientology, and my girlfriend had just gone off with one of our friends,
Hmm.
and but I was 19, and that's not fair.
Yeah, little betrayal. Yeah.
Yeah, and and looking back, it was the best for both of us. We were not suited to be with one another, and that's an end to it. But
I had the same experience, John, by the way. So
oh, how interesting!
I
We
did.
can
Yeah,
we can compare
I
notes.
didn't join a cult unless my group of friends would be considered a cult. They just
Mm. We
kind
became a
of
psychiatrist.
came around me, rescued me, got angry at the perpetrator, and
Oh,
all that sort of stuff. So it
that's
turned out,
interesting. I wish I'd known your friends. That would have been. I talk with everybody and anybody who'd listen to me, which is, I'm afraid, the way I am, and nobody really had anything to say to me. I
oh,
didn't feel comforted. I didn't feel. So I talked. I, in fact, knew a psychiatrist. So I had a friend who I'd known from the age of 13, and when she did a psychiatric assessment on me because I'd run away from home.
mm,
Now, had I just run away from home, everything would have been fine. But I ran away with my girlfriend. And when you're 13, you're not supposed to do that.
yeah, really
Or
hard
she ran
to.
away with me. What can I say? And so the headmaster of the prestigious school that I was going to was particularly vindictive towards me because he'd messed up two of my brothers' lives already. We
Oh
were
wow.
I was the last remaining target. So he thought, well, I'll get him. We'll send him for a psychiatric assessment. I went, and this lovely woman, and there was a psychologist as well, and they put me all through, these kind of tests that they give to rats, I think, to see how clever they are. And at the end of it, I was told that I was not suffering from any mental problem, which is always nice to know. I didn't think I
Yeah.
was, but and that my problem was that I was perhaps, I think it was put something like a little above average intelligence. So it
Mm,
was nothing to write home about. I wasn't a screaming genius or anything, but I was, and the psychiatrist said to me, if you want to come and see me, you can, but I can't see you as a patient because there's nothing wrong with you. And
mm.
so I I really liked it.
That's interesting in itself, why a psychiatrist would make that
Hmm.
conclusion, but it makes sense in the sense that, okay, we're only supposed to help people who have a diagnosable
Yeah.
formal disorder, but people suffer for other reasons. And so it's like, why shouldn't we or couldn't we work with people? Now, maybe we can't use insurance in the same way, but why can't we still help even because there's a whole lot of problems below official diagnoses like
Hmm.
loneliness, burnout, et cetera, that we should be able to help with. So that's an aside, but kind of I didn't
No,
like that
I think it's a
conclusion. Yeah.
very valid aside, and I think that the problem I was suffering from, as all 13-year-olds do, was adolescence, and which is a very baffling situation.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so I I understood that she was largely seeing 14-year-olds who'd fallen pregnant or
Mm,
14-year-olds who'd got into knife fights, and her day finished, her working day finished at 8 o'clock at night. It started at 8 in the morning. And so I'd go along there when she was finished and, play her my latest Led Zeppelin record, which she wasn't very keen on, or read her some of my awful juvenile poetry, what Douglas Adams would call Vogon poetry, in fact, I think. And we'd have a conversation, and we'd often be an hour and a half sitting and talking. And that, I saw her every, there was no regular thing, but I certainly saw her once a month for the next 4 or 5 years. And so, when I got into trouble, I called her up.
Mhm.
To my amazement, she said, "Oh, I can't talk to you now because I'm only licensed to see under 18-year-olds." And it's sort
Ah,
of, well, I wasn't really calling you for a professional conversation. I was calling you to say, "Oh, do you know some way through this?" And I talked to my doctor, and I talked to a vicar. I wasn't religious, but seemed like they might know something about things.
mhm.
And along the way, I encountered Scientology, but my
And
family
they
didn't know. They
and
knew what to do about it, and they were very friendly,
uh-huh.
and they were genuine as well, which was an interesting part of the puzzle that people don't seem to understand. That the leaders of these groups are generally fairly malevolent, domineering, controlling. We might call them narcissists. They are quite often. We might call them sociopaths. They are quite often. But they often know that what they're doing is a scam, that what they're doing is controlling people for their own ends.
Yeah, that's a
But
very interesting and important conclusion because when we think about politics, that sort of question comes up a lot with, say, President Trump. Is he doing what he's doing because he thinks it's right or for some
mm,
ulterior, reason? So
mm.
sounds like that's similar to the cult leaders.
Yeah, I mean, um, it's a year or so back, I was on a show with a guy called Eric Hunley, who's I really like, and he's a Trump supporter. And when I asked him, and this is before the election cycle had really got going, when I asked him why he was a Trump supporter, he said because he's good at playing three-dimensional chess.
Mm,
And I admit I had to go away from that conversation. I'd heard about Star Trek having three-dimensional chess, but
mm,
I didn't know that this has become a meme,
mm,
and that what it means is good at scamming people.
mm,
And that,
mhm,
I have heard this idea before, that to be a great politician, you have to be Machiavellian, and I don't agree. And I've since the idea was first put to me about 20 years ago, in fact, by one of my brothers, I have wrestled with that thought. There must be a kind of post Machiavellian kind of politics. There must be a place where somebody is bright enough to understand the Machiavellians, but doesn't behave as they do. Is able to look at the good of all rather than, the good of themselves or the good of their nation, or what have you. But
You know, yeah, I mean, in the United States, as soon as you said that, I started to think of our recent presidents. And
mm,
some people, perhaps myself, would pull out President Obama
mm,
for that maybe he didn't get elected because of the use of Machiavellian stuff so much. It was other ways that attracted people. So he might be an exception. I don't know for sure because I just crossed my mind, but
yeah,
yeah,
he's very interesting. I think Obama and Jimmy Carter are well
Jimmy
worth
Carter,
study. Yeah.
good, yeah, good
Um,
example.
it I mean, it's perverse, and that that's the way I am. But Obama actually used Cambridge Analytica in his campaign, as did Nelson Mandela, as
Mm,
they were before they got everything sorted out with Facebook, and really got things going.
yeah,
So even there was a certain willingness, or an acceptance, that public relations is not necessarily an ethical practice, and well, let's use it anyway. It
yeah.
certainly not to the extreme that say Nixon used, his crafty wiles.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and that would bring us into that other question of is it possible to work on the world stage and be a decent human being?
Mm-hmm.
With Obama, the drone strikes are fundamentally war crimes. Sorry to say, but I can't see drone strikes in any other way where you're killing civilians. And of course, he wouldn't release the torture report, having said that he would close Abu Ghraib. Abu Ghraib. Having said that he would close Guantanamo Bay, get the right word there, on the first day of his presidency, that he'd close it within a year. He didn't close it, and he didn't release the torture report. and thankfully
Yeah,
it did come out. But I think he is fundamentally a decent human being. That's the impression I have. Who the office, you know, brought him to a situation where he did things that I consider improper and
yeah,
wrong. But
yeah. I mean, we should just again, it sort of this reminds me of another example, and of course, in that example you used of torture, psychologists especially were involved in
mm,
supporting that.
mm,
Psychiatrists, not so much, and we
no,
sent a principle of not participating in that, but psychologists did.
mm,
But it also makes me think of the recent presidents and presidents elect, because you mentioned wartime, and it's
mm,
pretty fascinating to me that during Trump's first administration, there were no wars going on. He actually did not start a war.
mm,
Biden's last term, two wars started. Um,
mm,
one, Ukraine invading Russia, which to me should have been obvious that it was going to happen once Russia, went to the border and stayed there. And so presumably it could have been stopped before it happened, but hands off. And then, of course, the war in the Middle East with Israel,
mm,
Hamas, now Hezbollah, Iran. And so we've got these two difficult wars during
mm.
Biden's administration. And I think lots of people would have thought it would have been the opposite. We'd have more wars during Trump's administration. So this is complicated, isn't it? What do you value, and do paradoxical things happen that we don't expect?
Mm.
Again, to me, somehow gratitude gets connected to all that. So,
Yeah, I think that's right, and because the opposite of gratitude, ingratitude,
mhm.
becomes paramount, and we've seen a situation in the world. I think after World War II that there was not enough gratitude towards the Russians. I was in St. Petersburg 10 years ago, and so my driver was saying how annoying he found it that American tourists would come and say, "We saved you during World War II. We won World War II." And of course, the Russians lost at least 20 million people fighting that war, maybe as many as 28.
Yeah,
And so they don't see it quite that way. And of course, the British funded it and were still paying for it until I think 2004. So Lend-Lease and getting arms to Russia that were bought from America, paid for by Britain. So, and it's easy to get caught up in that. For me, I am grateful that Hitler was stopped. I wish that Stalin could have been stopped as well. I wish that Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the bombing of Dresden and many other events had never happened.
yeah,
And I strongly agree with the point that Nuremberg should have tried the victors as well as, the losers. But nonetheless, I think Nuremberg was right. I think that those people deserved, when you've taken part in the killing of hundreds of thousands or millions of people, I think there should be some sort of trial. But I think that the world has shifted away from the gratitude that was felt for the Marshall Plan and the tremendous things that the US, maybe the US was great at that point. Maybe that's when we make America great again, it will be the nobility of the Marshall Plan. Though, of course, there were other things happening there, the reformation of the CIA and horrible interventions like the deposing the democratic governments of many countries, including Iran. But I think that with the supposed end of the Cold War, that we stopped feeling gratitude towards America and understanding that there was a context to the terrible things that were done by the British, by the Americans, by what have you. And that context was the dangers of China and of Russia. And that those dangers have never gone away. Mao Zedong, while we were doing whatever we could to reconstruct the world, or while people were doing that, he was starving 45 million Chinese in the late 50s and early 60s. Stalin, of course, had rounded up, 11 million people and put them into camps. He created the model that Hitler would follow. So, yeah,
Yeah,
I
that's
think,
a complication of gratitude. Yeah, you could be gratitude
mm,
for certain things,
yeah,
but then probably shouldn't be grateful for other things. And then how do you balance that out?
mm,
Yeah, I think your analysis of Russia's role in the war is really important,
mm,
and it always fascinates me about Germany that um, Germany was obviously helped economically after the war and has turned into a friend not only of the United States but Jews in general. Almost unbelievable that that could happen after war, but it
mm,
also shows, I think, what gratefulness and helping others can do in
mm,
a mutual way. Um, but it's complicated because it's you can't I you're a fool if you only isolate out the good things in people or countries, whatever. Both people and countries are much more complicated than that.
mm. Absolutely. It brings us to the other side of gratitude. And before we started talking, you brought up the idea of disgust. In my work, I talk about inducing aversion, and that to me seemed, when I came to the field, it's very much there's a recognition of phobia induction and of guilt induction, that you get people to feel scared and you get them to feel guilty. But another major part of it, and it could be thought of as a phobia, is aversion. That when we look at, say, the way the Nazis, you look at, Nazi poster art with the hook-nosed Jew and
Mm-hmm.
the idea that all Jews carried fleas, which in turn, or lice, which would in turn pass diseases on to other people. And this was actually believed in the same way that currently Russian soldiers believe that Ukraine is a Nazi state
Mm-hmm.
run by a Jew. Okay, fine. Um, so
Well,
that opposite,
as a Jewish president, so
yeah, exactly,
you can throw in
exactly.
a little teeny bit of truth, which always
Mm,
helps, you know, delusions and paranoia to develop. There's this little kernel of truth which is used to support all the untruth that happens around it.
mm. I mean, I was amazed. A few years ago, I spoke with a friend and found out that he was a Holocaust denier, and that's something that goes straight to me. That I is what? How? Are you kidding me? And and started bringing out the very arguments that the Nazis themselves used about, well, the Jews created communism. Interesting thought. Trotsky was Jewish. Yeah. Oh,
And,
that's in. Marx was Jewish, and you're kind of going, yeah, they were non-observant though. They grew up in families that were not in the least bit religious. And it's like, oh well, but and there's this idea that they're this kind of black and white thinking, the us and them. So that creation of enmity, where somebody is of necessity wrong. I was talking to my friend Rachel Bernstein last week, and she told me the story about some white supremacists driving past a Native American meeting of some kind, and they shout out, and you've got to believe it. They shout out, "Go home" to them, and one of the guys says, "Well, yeah, you're right. My home is actually two yards that way. Why don't you go home?" you know?
mhm.
And
Where from originally, yes.
yeah, how crazy it gets, and how people attach to things as being right, not simply true but correct. That
Mhm.
so I mean, with neo Nazis who are of Polish descent, for example, they haven't studied history,
Mhm.
because they were one of the targets. Himmler issued orders. I'm reading this at the moment for something I'm working on. Himmler issued orders to the Waffen SS, the military aspect of the SS, to kill 30 million people on their way to Moscow.
Mhm.
And they set about doing that.
Yeah,
In fact, they may well have met that target.
yeah,
So that they could resettle German people. Now, that would have included any Poles who were not blonde.
sure, sure. Yeah, and it sort of fits the common principle of what have you done lately for me in terms of
Mm,
gratitude?
mm,
Okay, you know, we made this deal to work together and fight a war together, but don't need it anymore. So bye bye. So
Mm.
the gratefulness. Another limitation is that it can be quite limited unless a person embraces it as a core principle of their belief system. Otherwise it's used and then just discarded.
Yeah, and I mean, thinking about it, that prayer is an expression, or could be an expression of gratitude, and it's
Yeah,
been shifted round by prosperity Christians, for example, to be a kind of, oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes Benz, where you're no longer wishing for good for other people, you're wishing for prosperity for yourself. So it
that's it.
becomes narcissistic prayer.
Yeah, in prayer, I joke with my wife a lot about this because she uses prayer a lot, not myself so much, but you know, in sports, people pray for their team to win, and if they win, they think their prayer is answered. Well, what about the people who prayed for the other side?
Mm.
Why don't you pray when things are just good? Don't wait until there's problems, but pray when things are good for the good things in life to continue. So, yeah, prayer can be used in this kind of complicated, paradoxical way also. I'm not knocking prayer in any sense of the word. I think it's potentially very helpful, um, but again, it could be limited to what, as you said, is just kind of a narcissistic need that a person has, and you could understand that when times are bad, you want help anywhere you can get it, right? But nevertheless, that's not the whole way that prayer can help people.
Mm. And it seems, looking at the history of religious mysticism and religious mystics, as opposed to magicians and people of that type, but people like, say, Meister Eckhart, the great 14th century mystic, who said so many clever things. I'm not, as you know, I'm not religious. I'm agnostic, but I do think that focusing on one's gratitude, and that one sees this in Eckhart, in Molinos, in John the Obscure, Jude the Obscure, wherever we go, that there are people who have woken up to the wonder and beauty of life and are
Yeah.
grateful for that experience. And one can understand that there are people who are in desperate straits who don't feel grateful. But the expression of gratitude, as we find it in, say, Islam, that the idea that you thank the beggar when you give the gift to them because they are making your life better. And
Mm-hmm.
that, and Muslims are hospitable as a fundamental idea. Even if you are the enemy, then if you ask for food, you will be fed. These ideas, of course, are not universal, but we find these ideas. I mean, for me, one of the beautiful ideas in Islam is the idea that God, Allah, created the world to appreciate His beauty.
Mm.
I like that idea.
Yeah, no,
Um,
that's beautiful. You picked out that example, religiously, and I think it's true from the book I edited, and probably you and Steve did a chapter for it. The book on Islam and Islamophobia and psychiatry, and now we're trying to work on a second edition. It kind of taught me that gratitude is kind of imbued in the religion, I think, more than others. On the
yeah.
other hand, as you implied, it can also get distorted and used for more nefarious purposes
Mm,
to say. But the religion itself, it's really embedded there,
mm,
and in that sense, is a good thing, I think.
mm.
So
And it seems to be so with any faith that it's a matter of interpretation, and the thought of priests blessing guns before they, or the Pope, who in the 11th century said that the commandment that says "Thou shalt not kill" is voided if the person you're killing is an infidel.
yeah,
And I was watching something the other night, and they were saying, "Oh, this such and such was the first time that it had been made." Yeah, they were criticizing Islam and saying, "Oh, they say that you will go to heaven and get 72 houris." I think they said virgins
Hmm.
in reward if you die in battle.
Hmm.
And this is actually being said. It was being said about Himmler liking the Muslims because they had this wonderful idea. And you're going, well, Valhalla. He was very big on the idea of Wotan, Odin, what have you. There you had Valhalla where warriors go, but also, yeah, in the 11th century, a Christian pope ruled that if you had the intention to kill a Muslim and you were killed, whether you killed them or not, you would go straight to heaven.
Mm.
It's kind of
Yeah,
okay.
it's a good reward if that fits your belief system, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But better to try and make heaven on earth. I somehow feel,
Hmm.
and it will be to some to some extent a matter of temperament. But I do feel very grateful. I do sometimes become distressed about what's happening in the world. But for my own life and having you know just about managed to get away with it, despite everything,
Yeah,
I'm grateful, and for the beauty of the world, the natural beauty of the world, and for the beauty that humanity contributes to the world through music, through architecture, through art, through cinema.
yeah. You
And
know,
I,
you're probably not as old as me, but I think that's one of the things when people review their lives when they get older, to see the gratitude, to feel the gratitude and know the gratitude for things that happen to them across their whole life, and including still being alive, maybe even if you have some sort of illnesses, I think it's part of becoming wiser as we get older to be able to appreciate the good things that have happened in our lives. When gratefulness actually isn't researched a whole lot, which is kind of interesting in itself, and it's only mainly researched in Western countries. Um, but what we do know when we talk about socioeconomics, that people who are poor can feel as grateful and more grateful than people who are wealthy. They've come to terms with their situation, but still see the good things in it. And so, it's not necessarily a product of having all the material things that you could want in life. So, like you said, if you have enough money to do what's more or less essential for yourself, then gratefulness should be there, right? So lots of stuff out of our control, of course, in life, but um, poor people can be just as grateful for what they have. That's not to justify the societal issues that keep people poor,
no,
but nevertheless, for them to be appreciate what they do have, I think is again a good thing.
absolutely, and it does seem that once you do have enough economically, that it doesn't matter then how much more you accumulate, it won't change how content you are with life. And in
Yeah,
fact,
happiness. Yeah.
yeah, my experience of rich people is variable, but I've met quite a lot of people who have money, and some of them, a few of them, have seemed to me to be happy. And I must say that those people were all people who had earned the money themselves. They had
Mm.
done something. They weren't people who had gambled to get the money through the stock exchanges or through any other means of gambling or real estate or what have you. There were people who'd actually put work in, and they deserve what they have from my perspective. I don't believe anybody deserves to be a billionaire. I think that's just ludicrous. But then you get people who have speculated, who have preyed upon others, and who have achieved a position of power in our society. And here we have the ungrateful. We have people who what's his name, David Maurer, I think it was, who was a linguist who became an expert on confidence tricks, and the movie The Sting is based upon his work, done through the 40s and 50s. And he was interested in the language of con artists, what's a cackle bladder and this kind of stuff. But he became very friendly with some of these people, and he came to find that there are rich people who will go back to be conned again. And the con artists say, well, the reason they come back to us, and they'll go back to the same person, thinking that the setup was the person who conned them, not the guy who was actually at the center of it. And they'll go back to them and sometimes for a third time, be taken for a third time. And what Mao was told was that these people, because they are rich, believe that it is out of virtue that they are rich, and that it is out of their own intelligence that they are rich. And they come to have an estimation of themselves which puts them beyond others. And they do not, therefore, have gratitude. They do not, therefore, appreciate that to a large extent, our talents can give us rewards, but our situation, luck, it is also significant, being there at the right moment. If Brian Epstein hadn't walked into the cavern that night, it might have taken the Beatles weeks more to become incredibly successful. Who knows? If he hadn't put them into nice suits and out of their leather jackets and all of that.
Oh, and it's what's morally difficult, I think, is the rich people who have made a lot of money by nefarious ways. What do they do with that money later in life, assuming they're not charged with any sort of crime or end up in jail like a couple of the nominations for Trump's administration represent? But anyways, if these rich people have done questionable things in life, do they then try to give back and use the money for, quotes, good purposes? And that happens fairly often because it's sort of a relief of maybe the guilt you might have felt. And do organizations readily take that money, or do they feel it's tainted? Well, most of the time they take the money in my experience. But I think that's a way of, trying to make up for what you've done in the past. And maybe there should be some gratitude for those kind of people that eventually do the right thing, with their wealth.
It is very difficult, isn't it? If you look at, Andrew Carnegie provides a wealth of examples that he accumulated a vast fortune, certainly because of the deaths of many people who were overworked, who were put into appalling conditions. And he benefited from that. And then the Carnegie Mellon Foundation distributes that money back. Looking at Bill Gates, Bill and Melinda Gates, and the last number I saw was they think they'd given $56 billion away. And then you hear Bill Gates boasting about how much money he made on the vaccinations. And you kind of go, you were doing so well until you opened your mouth, Bill.
You revealed yourself a little bit, didn't you?
Yeah. And how much status is involved, and oh dear, it becomes so complicated. And whether philanthropy is a pure expression of gratitude, which one would like to think, or whether it's again narcissism and status. I had a friend who ran a charity in India until he came to the point where he discovered that the guy who the charity was named for, who he'd thought was a completely enlightened and brilliant man because he'd put all of his money in trust for this charity. And then he found the contracts that allowed this man to live an incredible, opulent life as a consequence of having given everything away. And the status that went with this, the position that went with this, that brings us back to the widow's mite in the Gospels, where the widow who gives a tiny little coin, which is all she can manage, and gives it quietly, is worth a lot more than the person who makes broad his phylacteries, and boasts and makes a noise about how much they've given. It's a conundrum. Because I think gratitude should be expressed openly, but it shouldn't be expressed to say, "Look how grateful I am." I'm a brilliant person because I'm so grateful. I fear it will be that's it's human nature, isn't it? To
Yeah,
go
you
off that.
don't. That's right. You don't really need to, but it is human nature. And
Mhm.
with charity and philanthropy and so forth, I think most of the time it's it's helpful, but it also has to be assessed. Is all this money really doing the things that it's supposed to do or not?
Mm,
It should be kind of part of the process, not to just assume you're giving the money for quotes a good cause and everything's fine. That's only partially of what needs to be done with it. What does it really end up doing?
mm,
Otherwise, it can be more just what you said, just a token of appreciation for what the person is doing. But the outcome maybe is not as good as it looks like it could have been or is.
mm,
So you need to build some outcome into it, just like we do with science and studies. We have to really find out whether what we're doing works well or
mm.
not just assume it looks like it's a good thing, but really add some proof to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Mother Teresa. Donald Trump during his campaign said something positive about Mother Teresa, and I don't share that feeling at all, having watched interviews with women who were nuns under her control and used the discipline, the knotted rope, to beat themselves on their inner thighs until they achieved a state of grace. Um,
Mm.
or a nurse who worked with her and said, well, she would find women who are dying and then refused to give them painkillers until they converted. And you're kind of going, oh, this is, and she's been sainted, she'd been sanctified by the Catholic
Wow.
Church. So it can get very confusing as to why people are doing what they're doing and how they're doing it. And fundamentally, if and I know people whose lives are based on gratitude, that they are grateful and that they are willing to give of themselves in consequence. I mean, my friend Christian Churko has spent 50 years and helped thousands of people now. And he has never charged anybody money for it. And he has never made any money. And he has, managed to get by. But
Mhm.
it's interesting that that is that is a life that comes out of faith. He's a Christian, and he is living the gospel. He's not become a priest. He's not got into the church. He's not involved with any of that, and he doesn't evangelize. So they haven't a life of gratitude, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. What you're saying reminds me of something I probably shouldn't say, especially
Well,
with the
go on
recent
then.
political appointments, a couple of them that President-elect Trump has made, which
Mm,
um, have kind of mixed reactions at the very least. But
mm,
it's your idea of there's people who do everyday things in life that are helpful to others. And what I'm loath to bring up because of the nepotism I just mentioned is, and you know her a little bit, is my wife.
mm,
I I I say she brings sunshine to people wherever she goes. It's her personality, it's
mm,
her regard for people. She's always looking for the positive. And there's many people, although I haven't met a whole lot of them, who I'm sure are like that just in their everyday presence and how they relate to people, um, bring sunshine, psychological sunshine to their lives. Um, and we should be grateful for those people. I'm certainly grateful for being around my wife for all these years. But there are these everyday people who do that, and they do it without notoriety, without
mm.
publicity, without people even taking it for granted. So I think that's something we all should keep in mind. Just the everyday. Um, Sometimes the word heroes is used for that,
Oh,
everyday heroes, but they're not really heroes. This is just who they are. And
mm.
they provide so much benefit to the world by just being who they are.
Mm, absolutely. I mean, the late, recently deceased Philip Zimbardo, his Heroic Imagination project, HIP, which probably wasn't quite as hip now as it might have been had he used the term in the 1960s. But his idea that we're all heroes and we can all be heroic and we can all do something positive in life, I think is important. And I agree with you that the word hero might not be the right word, but there are people who give something positive just by being.
Yeah, and he's an interesting, complicated example, and it brings in another wife to the to
Hmm.
what I mentioned. Because he led this Stanford Prison Project, which
Yeah.
way back had some questionable results. The students, whoever he recruited, were starting to act cruel to,
Hmm.
when they were the guards, they were acting cruel to the so-called prisoners.
Hmm.
And that got worse and worse. Well, who ended up stopping that other than his would-be wife,
Yeah.
who he was supposed to marry? And Maslock, I forget her first name, but she said,
Catherine, I
"I'm not
think.
going to marry you if you keep doing this." And he stopped, and then he evolved into this
Hmm.
other direction.
Hmm.
And she herself has gone on to do wonderful things as far as addressing burnout and
Hmm.
how society needs to deal with it. But it's an interesting example of how somebody can shift from doing more questionable things to good things that we now should be grateful for.
Hmm.
Um, and maybe we should be grateful for his early experiment, because paradoxically it's turned into something really good. And that
Hmm.
I think in part that's the nature of gratitude. There's paradox that's often
Yeah.
involved in it. And we have to keep in mind those paradoxes can occur, especially if we have a long range view of gratitude. So
I think that's true. And I mean, the Stanford prison experiment was closed on the sixth day. It only lasted 6 days.
yeah.
And Zim was very open about that what had happened and how his wife to be convinced him that he had to stop because he was sort of delighted that the experiment was proving this thing and
Right.
sort of going, but hang on a minute there. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, over the last few years, I've felt the need to defend his work on a few occasions because there's been such an attack upon it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've spoken elsewhere about that. I won't go into that here, but
Yeah.
it
I
was a
think
very
it's wonderful you did that too, because yeah, I mean, again, we need a longitudinal view about people and so on. And when there's also a shift for the better, we should recognize that, not just keep on emphasizing the wrong somebody did, and because we all do wrong things, and it's how what we learn from them and how we recover from doing the wrong things that are really the most important aspect of them. I
yeah,
mean,
the fact we're capable of change.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and he ended up doing great stuff. He was a great professor too. He taught at the college my son went to, Stanford. He was
Mm.
just a superb teacher.
Mm.
Students really valued him, and again, he shifted his points of view in his teachings too, which is a lesson in itself.
And he was always pointed in the right direction. He was trying to understand, along with Stanley Milgram and Muzaffar
Yeah,
Sharif, Solomon Asch, the big names.
yeah,
They were trying to understand how it was that the Nazi regime and perhaps the Japanese regime, which was fairly similar, how they had managed to generate such a following. We still don't have the answer to that question, but
and
we know
it
a lot
goes
more
back.
about it.
Yeah, and it goes right back to where we started
Mm.
with cults. You
Yeah.
know, because the same kind of process can happen in everyday life that were done in those
Mm.
experiments, and people in charge get people to listen to them, and it could develop into what at first looks like a good thing, but then ends up being bad because you end up under the control of the people in power. So those
Mm,
experiments were invaluable,
mm.
even though they looked not so good in how they were conducted or some of the things people did. But again, they showed what human nature is all about, even if we don't like what we see.
Yeah, and I think even where experiment fails in some way. I mean, Milgram's experiments changed ethical reviews
Hmm.
of experimentation, and that was right. Though I think Milgram was a remarkable human being.
Hmm.
He was very determined that what he was going to do would be scientific, and so repeated the experiment, I think 17 times. Which is checking the parameters of the experiment, not associating Yale with it anymore, moving it off campus. To see how far this went and what happened, and one can see that that became an overriding intellectual curiosity on his part, so that he perhaps forgot that people could be being traumatized
Hmm.
by what he was having them do.
Right.
But yeah, nonetheless, vital work. And with Muzaffar Sharif, the Robbers Cave experiment, that experiment has been falsified. There is no doubt that they encouraged the kids to fight with each other from the start. We know that. But Sharif's other choice was that he'd he'd been a member of the Communist Party. Iran had just already mentioned that once in this conversation. The democracy in Iran had been replaced with the Shah, who Amnesty International labelled, I think, the worst dictator of the late 20th century in terms of what he did. And Muzaffar Sharif knew that if it came out that he had been a member of the Communist Party, he'd be sent back to Iran and he'd be executed. So there was
Yeah.
another dynamic functioning, and he tried the experiment twice and failed to finish it. So he had, but you get that thing at the end of the Robbers Cave where the kids are brought back together to repair the water supply, and they end up going home as friends, the warring factions. That part of the experiment seems to have not really been appreciated.
Right.
That he was looking at resolution, not simply, and reconciliation, not
Yeah.
simply at the propensity of human groups to wage wars with one another, which of
Yeah.
course is also not ultimately true. And we know this. We can watch work with primates, particularly bonobos, who when two packs meet, they threaten each other. They make all sorts of noises, and the females go off and have a cup of tea together while the males are showing their arses to each other. And then everybody settles down, and for a couple of weeks they go hunting together.
Well, don't the
Gathering together.
females do even more than that usually? They usually do some sexual
Well,
come out to the men that are fighting, and that sort of settles them down.
yeah, bonobos are known for that aspect of their behaviour. But yeah, but in human groups too, that we know that when nomadic peoples meet, they often as not sit down, light the fire, and tell some stories. Warfare is an interesting human quirk, and very ungrateful, if I may say. It's very ungrateful to go and fight wars, really, and we shouldn't do it.
Yeah. But we can see, in child development, we could see the natural tendencies
Mm,
of babies. They can be very altruistic to other babies, or
mm,
they can be mean to them. Part of it is their own genetic disposition. You can be
mm,
born with a more irritable disposition, but what's done with that even depends on the parents and other
mm,
people that raise the kids. So if you can positively reinforce the altruism, provide what the kid needs, then as individuals, they won't turn out to be warlike. But if the kids are traumatized or if their anger is reinforced by the
mm,
parents, then they're on the road to causing trauma to other people
mm,
and fall into a warlike kind of disposition as an adult. Men probably more than women, but the risk is really for all kids growing up. How how do you emphasize the altruism that's there naturally, over the natural disposition to be mean and hateful?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have the work of, say, James Fallon, about pro-social sociopaths, where he said that, and he's a neuroscientist, he said that into his 50s, he was absolutely convinced that everything is genetic in human beings. And then on a brain scan, it showed that he had his situation was the the paralimbic, the connection between the frontal lobes and the limbic system, the old brain, that he had the atrophy of that, which is Kent Keel and others have been finding in psychopaths. And he, realizing this, started to think about things his mother had said to him about him being an unusual child and that she'd had to restrain him. And he realized that he had all of the traits of the sociopath, but because of the childhood he'd had, because of the care that had been lavished upon him, he pranked people rather than destroying their lives, which would have been the other possibility. So yeah, how and is it the Mendota study, the juvenile centre, where some of the kids got counselling and some didn't, and the ones that didn't went on to commit, I think, 17 murders in the next couple of years, and the ones who had the counselling committed none, which is a very good real world test.
Yeah.
And broke through this idea that was so standard that there was nothing you could do about this condition, that if once a psychopath, always a psychopath. We now, from the Dunedin study in New Zealand, we know that people's mental health and their mental diagnosis changes throughout life, that there is no fixed personality at birth, as Jung and others thought, that we develop a character. We're born with a temperament and develop character, as Eric Fromm put it.
Yeah. It reminds me, I wish I could think of the name of this book in person, but there's a psychologist who wrote a recently very popular book, and she identified herself as being a sociopath, not for fun, for real.
Yeah.
She talked about what that entails, but also the good things she's ended up doing after realizing who she was, what kind of person she was. So made the switch to being able to be helpful, even with that kind of sociopathic tendency. Very interesting book. Maybe we can think about it after
Yeah,
the
and
show.
put it in the links when we remember what it is. I mean, Emmy Thomas's Confessions of a Sociopath is a chilling and fascinating book. And after writing it, she decided she wanted to change. She decided, and maybe there is something in our core concept here, that this is to do with gratitude, that a sociopath or a psychopath, they don't feel grateful. They don't feel thankful. They want to know how to exploit other people. I've had a few conversations with a guy called Sean McCraney, which are on the channel, who tests as a sociopath. And in 1997, had a roadside revelation that made him change the way he is. What's fascinating about him is he didn't then suddenly become a lovely person. He's the same person. He doesn't trust people. He does not naturally feel gratitude. But I think there was an influx of gratitude and a sense that there was something larger than him in the world and that he should tune himself to that. He sees that as a relationship with Jesus. I don't really, it's of no concern to me how people label these things. It's for them to decide what's happened to them, not for me. But he had a transcendent experience that allowed him to see that going out and getting drunk and drugged up and getting into fights was not a good way to be. And just to put it in context, he was a stockbroker at one point. We're not talking about some KKK loser here. We're talking about somebody who was successful in life but hurt other people, and he came to change that relationship. And I think that primarily what you're talking about, having a sense of gratitude for being alive. But,
I think
that changes your view, doesn't it? It changes your behavior.
Yeah, and I think this part of the conversation is so important because we tend to think about sociopaths sociopaths, full-blown sociopaths, as being rare.
Mm.
They're not really. I worked in a prison, and yes, there were sociopaths there, but when I started to study about it, it seemed like there were many more in general society who have used their sociopathic tendency to actually help them succeed in life. And I think
We were talking
once,
about billionaires, weren't we?
yeah, and maybe 20% of the everyday population has significant sociopathic tendencies, right? So there's something about what's there that could be helpful if it's used in the right direction. I think there's a myth that sociopaths aren't empathetic. I think that's also proven to be wrong. They actually happen to be very empathetic. That's how they get away with so much stuff, because they do understand people. It's what they do with the empathy that's the problem. And maybe, as you're suggesting, be more grateful about that gift, that it could help not only them and other people instead of being used to harm other people. So, but it's a big social problem. This tendency is not uncommon.
And our society encourages it at all levels: competition, winning, dominating, not being a loser. That this idea of being the authority, the authoritarian, it's very dangerous. And I mean, Simon Baron-Cohen in Cambridge studying autism has put forward this spectrum that has at one end of it cognitive empathy, understanding other people's feelings, and at the other end, affective empathy, having feelings. And he says, and I think it might be a little too simple, but he says that the sociopath is at one end of the scale, and the psychopath they can understand what other people are feeling and manipulate it, but they don't have the feelings themselves. Whereas somebody who is autistic has a tremendous amount of feeling, but they can't necessarily read other people's feelings.
It's interesting, yeah.
Then you have Robert Hare's differentiation between which he made late on in Without Conscience in 1992. He says sociopath and psychopath describe the same thing. In Snakes in Suits, 10 years later, he says that he is going to use the term psychopath for somebody who scores more than 30 on his test, between 30 and 40 on his test, and he's going to use the word sociopath for somebody who scores between 4 and 30. And then the differentiation comes that the sociopath, it does have, they can have conscience, whereas a psychopath is a person without conscience. Yeah, and again, these are absolutes. Yeah. But, and we're all, I mean, I ponder it often. It's like if we're talking about our compassion, I've had periods of my life where I didn't eat meat. I've had 3 periods totaling 4.5 years and all. I have eaten meat again for a long time since. I don't eat much of it. But I understand the moral argument. And it's interesting that we should be so horrified at the thought of killing another human being, but quite happy to kill a pig, or a cow. It's a matter of degree, isn't it? And in warfare, the willingness to kill the enemy because the enemy is going to kill you. To what extent is this? Have we become sociopaths in some area of our regard?
That's right. All of us have the potential, or at least some of that. And yeah, it's interesting in war. I mean, one way it makes it easier for people to kill one another is to call the other side animals or something like that, as if animals should be disregarded. But we can just kill all animals. So if humans like an animal, that's fine. Well, that's wrong to start with. Animals are valuable to the world and not to be something that could just be tossed aside.
Yeah, I mean, I had a sort of weird documentary last week that stopped and made me think. We currently legislation is being discussed about animal rights and whether it's okay to inflict pain on animals. A particular case is the lobster. and that lobsters, if dropped into boiling water, can survive for as much as 3 minutes in intense agony. So, you know, but what has come up is that people are studying insects have said, well, insects feel pain too. Contrary to what has been taught in the past, we can now demonstrate that insects feel pain. Also, that insects do things that are a bit freaky at times. And the one that got me was earwigs. I remember finding an earwig nest when I was a child and being a little bit freaked out. But the earwigs are the only known insect to look after their young. And so they did an experiment where they took the mother earwig away and they then watched to see what happened with the baby earwigs and would they be able to function as parents. And they weren't. And so it's the idea that even an earwig can be learning something, so, and passing it on, through a cultural transmission, as we call it. So where do we put those boundaries, and to what extent can we consider ourselves compassionate? If, possibly, as L. Ron Hubbard thought, tomatoes are getting upset when we eat them. I doubt that very much, as there's nothing alive in a tomato other than the seeds. It is just a vessel, but nonetheless, it was a cause of inquiry, and it does come back. Our plants feeling pain. What can we and can't we do? If we become vegetarian, doesn't that mean all the cows will die because nobody's going to eat them? The moral questions we come into.
That's interesting.
And yeah, sorry.
Oh, it just made me associate this recent discussion, to the time we visited Bhutan, where the people's beliefs are any living thing is to be honored. And you don't even step on an ant. If you see an ant, you go around it. Everything is precious, and every living thing. And I thought it was such a good philosophy. I'm not sure if it could really be applied all over the place, but I was really impressed because they do follow it, or they did. I'm not, this is a dozen years ago now, probably, or 10 years ago, but I know the country is also modernizing a lot, and I hope they don't lose some of these values as they become a more modern country.
Yeah, I mean, it's an aspect of the Tibetan Buddhism in that area. And I mean, in 7 Years in Tibet, when the author, the Dalai Lama, who was the current Dalai Lama, it was him all those years ago during World War II, wanted a cinema. And the monks got really worried because they started digging foundations. And sort of, but you'll hurt the worms, I was a bit surprised because I'm doing research on the Nazis, so I was watching the film they took in Tibet. And you've got film of monks beating people with canes. It's like, oh, so much for compassion, We have the Jains,
yes,
who again will wear masks and sweep things. And you're going, well, what about bacteria and viruses? Don't they have rights too? And fungi,
even though we can't see them. That's right. Yeah. Exactly.
Oh dear. Well, we really have kicked this about a little bit, which has been great. And thank you so much, Steve. So please, everybody, write lots of comments and make them nice. And I'm sorry we've said nasty things about Donald Trump. We love him really, and we wish him well. We're just terrified of what might happen.
I always fall back on paradox. Maybe the people who don't like President Trump, maybe they'll be pleasantly surprised with some things. That's why I brought up the war example. But I don't know. It's like sitting on pins and needles here of what's going to occur over the next 4 years.
Well, he did promise us, and it was a promise, that before the inauguration, if he was elected, he would end the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine. So I hope that he's able to do that. That would be great.
Well, a little piece of the war in the Middle East has now stopped. Ceasefire in Lebanon, right?
Yes. Let's hope it holds.
I actually always thought that when President Biden became president, he should have been very grateful to President Trump about one thing, which is for all the mistakes that Trump made in the initiation of addressing the pandemic, he really sped up the development of the vaccines and should have been thanked for that. I think that might have had some kind of positive aspect on him, but Biden didn't do that. Maybe couldn't do it. But gratefulness can be applied even to people in situations you don't like if they do something that's really good. So
yeah, absolutely. And as you said earlier, we have to consider the whole context. We have to consider what's right and what's wrong. So I'm afraid that just about every president and every leader, every king, every prime minister will have done something awful. That seems to be the nature of it. I mean, on the Middle East, the other thing that's happened, which I'm pleased about, is that Aleppo has been taken out of Syria, and because Russia is busy in Ukraine, and because America is not, has some activity there, there's a possibility that Assad will fall, and he is truly one of the worst human beings of all time.
And a physician, trained as a physician.
Yeah. Well, 45% of medical doctors joined the Nazi party in the.
That's right. Liston's work about that. Yeah.
The Nazi Doctors. Yeah. Incredible book. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Steve. And we'll get together again in the nearness of time. So please, everybody, write comments if you've managed to get this far with our conversation and ask questions. We're always happy to field that.
By all means. And if I see them and they're addressed to me, I'll answer them. So please do.
Great. Thanks very much, Steve.
Thank you. Thank everybody for watching.
And Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.